In every civilization's final hour, there comes a moment when time itself seems to hesitate, when empires breathe their last beneath the weight of their own legends. In the dying light of the 15th century, such a moment unfolded in the heart of Andalusia. The mountains of southern Spain bore silent witness as two worlds collided, one built on the golden age of Islamic culture, the other rising in the name of a Christian dawn. The city of Granada stood between them, suspended between past and future, faith and conquest, art and ashes. What began as a siege would end as a transformation, not just of a kingdom, but of the world itself. This is the story of how 7 centuries of Muslim Spain came to an end, and how the fall of Granada ignited the beginning of a new age. In the twilight of an era, when the echoes of empires still lingered over the hills of Andalusia, one city stood alone between two worlds, one fading into memory, the other rising with relentless fire. It was the winter of 1492. The last Muslim stronghold in Europe prepared to face the inevitable. On the horizon, the banners of Castile and Aragon shimmered like omens beneath the pale dawn. The fall of Granada would mark more than the end of a kingdom. It would close a chapter written over 7 centuries of Islamic civilization in Spain. A civilization that had transformed deserts into gardens, ignorance into knowledge, and faith into art. What would unfold here would change not only Iberia, but the course of the entire world. As dawn's first light crept across the snow-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevada, the defenders of Granada gazed toward the Christian camp at Santa Fe. Smoke rose from the encampment, a grim reminder that Ferdinand and Isabella would not retreat until the city itself had surrendered. This was no ordinary siege. It was the culmination of 8 centuries of conflict, the final heartbeat of Al-Andalus, a civilization that had once stretched from the Pyrenees to Gibraltar. The question was not just how Granada would fall, but how such brilliance had been reduced to its final flame. The answer lay in betrayal, division, and ambition. For years, the Catholic monarchs had maneuvered with cold precision, determined to complete the Reconquista, the Christian reclamation of the Iberian Peninsula. But the collapse of Granada had begun long before their cannons arrived. Its roots stretched back to 1238, when Muhammad I ibn Nasr founded the Nasrid dynasty. For over 2 centuries, the Nasrid survived through diplomacy and tribute, balancing power between Christian kings and Muslim empires. They built the Alhambra, a palace of dreams, where poetry and geometry fused into stone, and preserved the last spark of Islamic learning in Europe. Yet by 1482, that spark had begun to fade. The aging Sultan Abu al-Hasan Ali faced rebellion from his son, Muhammad XII, known to the Christians as Boabdil. Their conflict tore the kingdom apart. As father fought son, Ferdinand and Isabella watched patiently, ready to strike when weakness appeared. And it came soon enough. In 1481, Abu al-Hasan refused to pay the annual tribute demanded by Castile. When envoys came to collect, he declared that the mints of Granada now coined not gold, but steel. His defiance was bold and fatal. Ferdinand seized the opportunity to declare war, launching what would become the Granada Campaign, a war of faith, fire, and gunpowder. The Christians had mastered the new art of artillery, massive cannons capable of tearing through walls that had stood for centuries. Cities that once could withstand sieges for years crumbled in weeks. Inside Granada, civil war made resistance impossible. Boabdil, supported by the Abencerrages clan, seized the Alhambra and proclaimed himself sultan. His father fled to Malaga, dividing the realm's already limited power. When Boabdil attempted to prove his strength by attacking the Christians at Lucena in 1483, disaster struck. His army was crushed, and he himself was captured. But Ferdinand did not execute him. He saw a greater use for the young ruler as a pawn. In captivity, Boabdil was offered a cruel bargain: cooperate or see his people destroyed. The Pact of Córdoba sealed his fate. In exchange for recognition as Sultan, Boabdil agreed to serve as Ferdinand's vassal and assist in conquering his own lands. With that pact, the Nasrid dynasty began to devour itself. Boabdil's uncle, Muhammad al-Zaghal, known as the Valiant, continued to fight fiercely in the east, even defeating Christian armies. But he was trapped between enemies, the advancing Christians on one side and Boabdil's betrayal on the other. Every victory he earned only delayed the inevitable. As the Christians advanced, the moral heart of Granada collapsed. Cities fell not because of conquest, but because of division. When Malaga was besieged in 1487, its defenders cursed Boabdil for abandoning them. When Baza surrendered in 1489, it was his envoys who negotiated the surrender. The Nasrid dynasty's authority withered into dust. Meanwhile, Isabella gave the war a divine purpose. She transformed it from conquest into crusade. Dressed in armor, she appeared before her troops, blessing the cannons and proclaiming that the campaign was holy. Her presence gave the Christian army not only strength, but conviction. They were fighting not merely for territory, but for God. By 1490, al-Zaghal's resistance collapsed. Betrayed and cornered, he surrendered and departed for North Africa. The last kingdom of Al-Andalus was now reduced to Granada itself, a single city standing defiant amid ruin. Boabdil, freed from his alliance with Ferdinand, made one final gamble. He broke his vassalage, declaring independence. Perhaps he sought redemption. Perhaps he simply refused to die a puppet. Whatever his reason, his rebellion came too late. Ferdinand and Isabella surrounded Granada with a massive army. For months, the city endured bombardment, starvation, and despair. From the Alhambra, Boabdil watched as his peoples will crumbled. He knew that to continue fighting was to invite slaughter. And so, in January 1492, he made the choice that history would never forget. He surrendered. On the cold morning of January 2nd, the last Sultan of Granada rode out to meet the conquerors. He handed the keys of the Alhambra to Ferdinand and Isabella, the symbols of 7 centuries of history, faith, and civilization. Behind him, the city of red walls and golden towers stood silent. Ahead of him, exile. The story of Granada's fall was not simply the end of a city. It was the twilight of an age, an era that had given Europe its first universities, its libraries, its medicine, its architecture, and its poetry. As Boabdil crossed the mountains, he looked back one last time at the city that had been his birthright, now lost to history. His mother's words still echo through time. Weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man. And with that final glance, the light of Al-Andalus faded forever, and a modern world began. In the spring of 1491, as Andalusia bloomed with life, the fate of an entire civilization was being sealed. For years, Ferdinand and Isabella had dreamed of this moment, the final conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Europe. That April, their dream took physical form as the largest army ever assembled in Spanish history gathered on the plains outside the city. 80,000 soldiers stood ready beneath the blazing sun, knights in polished armor, crossbowmen from Genoa, pikemen from Switzerland, and countless militias from every province of Castile and Aragon. Their banners fluttered like waves in a human sea. At the center stood the thunderous bombards, massive cannons capable of leveling walls that had stood for centuries. It was not merely an army, it was Christendom's vengeance given flesh. Ferdinand had become a patient strategist through the long years of war. He no longer believed in the swift assault or the grand charge of knights. Victory, he had learned, came through endurance, by choking the enemy slowly, leaving no road open, no hope unbroken. This time, his army would not retreat for winter. They would stay until the city was his. And to prove it, he built something the world had never seen in the middle of the battlefield, a permanent city of war. The Christian army began raising wooden walls and laying stone foundations beside Granada's ramparts. What started as a collection of tents became streets, churches, and markets. A settlement emerged, organized with geometric precision, its construction a message carved into the land itself. We are not leaving. Within weeks, it became a thriving town, Santa Fe Holy Faith. Its name was chosen deliberately. It was not a military term, but a sermon in stone, a declaration that the conquest of Granada was not just a political act, but a divine command. From the towers of the Alhambra, Sultan Boabdil watched in disbelief as Santa Fe grew day by day. He saw Christian women hanging laundry, children chasing each other through narrow streets, and merchants calling out prices as if they were in Seville. The sight was unbearable, an entire civilization settling outside his gates, confident that victory was inevitable. The message was cruelly clear. Even if Granada's walls stood unbroken, its future had already been written. Inside the city, life was collapsing. Once a jewel of Al-Andalus, home to poets, scholars, and artisans, Granada had become a prison filled with hunger. The population had swelled with refugees from conquered towns. Families slept in courtyards and alleys, clutching what little they had left. The markets, once alive with color and music, now echoed with emptiness. The Christians had cut off every mountain pass and valley road, sealing the city from the world. Grain dwindled to dust. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Mothers boiled grass and roots to quiet their children's cries. In the royal warehouses, food was measured by the handful. Even the most optimistic calculations foretold starvation before summer's end. Each sunrise brought fewer options and heavier silence. And from every tower, the people could see the white tents of Santa Fe gleaming in the sun, a taunting reminder that the enemy feasted while they starved. Boabdil, the last sultan of Granada, struggled under the weight of a crown that had become a curse. His court fractured into chaos. Some counselors pleaded for surrender to spare the city. Others demanded one last stand to preserve its honor. Even the noble Abencerrage clan, once his most trusted allies, divided into factions, some seeking negotiation, others preparing to flee across the sea. Rumors of betrayal spread through the narrow streets like smoke. Neighbors accused one another of treason. Fear turned brother against brother. Desperate, Boabdil reached beyond his walls for salvation. Messengers were sent to the great powers of Islam, to the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, to the Hafsids of Tunis, to the Mamluks in Cairo. Each letter carried the same plea: aid us before it is too late. But the world had already turned its back. The Ottomans were fighting their own wars in the east. North Africa was fractured by tribal rivalries. Egypt remained silent, its rulers unwilling to bleed for a kingdom so distant. One by one, every plea was met with silence. Granada stood utterly alone. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's power grew. His lines tightened like a noose. His engineers mapped every wall, every gate, every possible escape. He understood that the real battle was not for the walls, but for the will of the defenders. And as the months dragged on, his gold did what his cannons could not. Bribes found their way into trembling hands, a gate guard here, a merchant there. Small betrayals eroded the city's defenses from within. Then Isabella arrived. The queen's presence changed everything. She transformed the siege into something divine. Draped in royal robes, she established her court in Santa Fe, holding audiences, receiving envoys, and showing the world that Christian order already ruled the land. Every morning, she prayed openly in view of Granada's walls, her faith radiating like the dawn. For the starving Muslims watching from the battlements, her composure was a knife twisting deeper, the embodiment of a destiny they could no longer resist. Inside Granada, hopelessness hardened into despair. Starving soldiers launched reckless night raids, trying to steal food or destroy siege engines. but they were cut down one after another. Their bodies lay in the barren space between the walls and the Christian camp, silent warnings to those still dreaming of resistance. The winter winds returned, bringing with them surrender's cold whisper. Even the most devout imams no longer prayed for victory, but for mercy. In the Alhambra's once glorious halls, poets stopped writing of love and faith. Their verses now spoke of loss, of gardens turned to graves, of stars fading behind the smoke. Scribes drafted letters of submission, their ink mixing with tears. Families huddled around dying fires, whispering stories of the golden age of Al-Andalus as if speaking to ghosts. And in the highest tower of the Alhambra, Boabdil stood alone, gazing toward the Christian city that had risen like a prophecy of his ruin. The smoke of Santa Fe rose steadily into the gray sky, each column a monument to his defeat. His mother, Aixa, the fierce queen who had once urged him to fight for his crown, now begged him to surrender to save his people from extinction. Granada's fate was sealed not by sword or cannon, but by time, by hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless will of its enemies. The empire that had once turned deserts into gardens and built a civilization of light and learning now faced its final dusk. And as Ferdinand's banners fluttered in the cold winter wind, the world watched the closing of a chapter that had defined centuries, the end of Al-Andalus and the dawn of a new Spain. By November of 1491, the fate of Granada hung by a thread. The once magnificent jewel of Al-Andalus, the final stronghold of Muslim Spain, was now a city of exhaustion and quiet despair. Beneath the cold autumn moon, secret envoys slipped through the no-man's land between the walls of Granada and the Christian encampment of Santa Fe. They carried messages that would decide the destiny of a civilization that had flourished for nearly 8 centuries. Inside the torch-lit halls where those secret meetings took place, Boabdil's weary representatives sat across from Ferdinand's envoys. The air was thick with tension and smoke, and though the words exchanged were courteous, their meaning was sharp as steel. The negotiations that unfolded were not between equals. They were the final conversations between conqueror and conquered. Ferdinand's demands were unyielding: complete surrender of the city, acknowledgement of Christian sovereignty, and heavy reparations for past insurrections. Yet as the talks dragged on, the tone began to shift. Perhaps realizing the enormous challenge of governing a large Muslim population by force, the Catholic monarchs adopted a strategy that combined diplomacy with conquest. They began offering terms that, for the standards of the 15th century, seemed astonishingly generous. The Muslims of Granada would be allowed to keep their property, practice their faith, and continue speaking Arabic. They would retain their schools, their judges, and their traditions. No one would be forced to convert. Those who could not bear to live under Christian rule will be given safe passage across the sea to North Africa, with time to sell their belongings before departure. When these terms were read aloud in the markets and mosques of Granada, they ignited every emotion imaginable. To some, they were a miracle, proof that God had not abandoned them. To others, they sounded like a cruel trick. The memory of past betrayals haunted every discussion. For decades, Christian promises had been broken as soon as the ink was dry. The people of Granada knew this well, and yet, amid hunger and despair, even false hope was hard to resist. At the center of it all stood Boabdil, the young sultan torn between 2 impossible paths. His heart still burned with pride, but his people were dying. His generals urged defiance. His religious scholars pleaded for protection of the mosques and the faith above all else. But for the starving citizens within the walls, the question had become painfully simple. Would their children live to see another sunrise? That question, born of desperation rather than politics, did what armies and fortresses could not. It ended Muslim rule in Spain. Years of betrayal and bloodshed had shattered Boabdil's court. The advisors who had once guided Granada with brilliance and courage were now gone, executed, exiled, or consumed by suspicion. What remained was a fractured circle of voices, each shouting a different truth. On one side stood his mother, Aixa, a woman of keen intelligence and hard-earned realism. She begged her son to accept the terms, believing that survival, even in defeat, was better than annihilation. On the other side were proud generals and pious scholars who saw surrender not as strategy, but as blasphemy. To yield, they said, was to betray God and history itself. By December, the cold winds from the Sierra Nevada carried with them a sense of finality. The siege had dragged on for months. Supplies had vanished. The citizens were gaunt with hunger. Morale was collapsing, and even the most loyal soldiers began to whisper that resistance was no longer noble. It was suicide. Boabdil's envoys continued their humiliating rides to Santa Fe, each visit stripping away another layer of dignity. Ferdinand, ever the strategist, sensed his advantage. He began manipulating the negotiations like a chess game, appearing merciful while tightening his grip. Every concession he offered came with a demand twice as heavy. He understood that the true victory was not in battle, but in the slow, deliberate breaking of an enemy's will. Then Isabella herself entered the stage. Her presence transformed the atmosphere entirely. The queen who had declared this war a holy mission, an act of divine purification, now became the voice of solemn mercy. She promised that those who laid down their arms would be protected. She spoke of peace, of coexistence, and of a new Spain united under law rather than blood. Her royal oath, rare and sacred, carried a weight no soldier could ignore. Even the most skeptical members of Granada's court found themselves moved by the sincerity of her words. And so, on November 25th, 1491, beneath the pale light of winter, the Treaty of Granada was signed. Written in both Arabic and Latin, the document marked the official end of Muslim sovereignty in Western Europe. It included a 2-month grace period before the final transfer of power, a brief interlude between eras, a pause before history's next great turning. News of the treaty swept through Granada like a storm. At first came relief. After endless months of starvation and bombardment, peace, however bitter, felt like deliverance. Merchants reopened their stalls, children returned to the streets, and for the first time in years, laughter echoed faintly through the Albicen's narrow alleys. Yet beneath this fragile calm ran deep rivers of grief and humiliation. The people of Granada had been spared, but their world had not. Inside the Alhambra, scholars and poets worked feverishly to save what they could of their culture. Priceless manuscripts were hidden in walls or smuggled across the sea. Artists composed farewell verses to a civilization fading into twilight. In homes and courtyards, families argued late into the night, whether to remain under Christian rule or abandon everything they had ever known for the uncertain promise of freedom. Granada became a city suspended between worlds, neither conquered nor free, neither Muslim nor yet Christian. Meanwhile, Ferdinand and Isabella prepared for the symbolic transfer of power with calculated precision. Ferdinand, a man of order, focused on logistics, appointing administrators, briefing the clergy, ensuring discipline among the troops. Isabella, ever conscious of divine imagery, turned her attention to ceremony. She designed the banners that would replace the crescent with the cross, selected hymns for the Victory Mass, and chose the biblical passages that would proclaim Spain's rebirth under one faith. She believed this was not merely conquest, but fulfillment of destiny. By late December, Granada had become a city of mourning. The mosques were filled with weeping worshippers offering their final prayers. Teachers gathered their pupils one last time, uncertain if the next generation would ever hear the Quran recited in public again. Shops closed, families packed what little they had left. And through it all, Sultan Boabdil remained silent, his once proud gaze dulled by sorrow. He walked the gardens of the Alhambra alone, listening to the fountains whisper the same songs they had sung to his ancestors, knowing that soon their voices would belong to another faith. Then came the final night of the Islamic year 897 AH, the last day of 1491. Over the rooftops of Granada, the muezzins called the evening prayer one last time. The sound was haunting, like a farewell to history itself. The city fell into a silence, so deep it seemed the earth itself was mourning. At dawn on January 2nd, 1492, sunlight spilled across the snow-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevada. From the walls of Granada, the people saw the Christian banners rising over the horizon. Ferdinand and Isabella approached in solemn procession, their armor gleaming, their banners heavy with the cross. There was no battle, no defiance, only quiet surrender. Boabdil rode out from the Alhambra with the remnants of his guard. Before the eyes of both armies, he dismounted and handed Ferdinand the keys to the city, a simple act that ended an empire. Chroniclers later wrote that as he turned to leave, he looked back at Granada one final time, tears streaming down his face. His mother, Aixa, watching from a distance, whispered the words that history would never forget. "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." And so, on that cold January morning, an entire civilization exhaled its last breath. The Reconquista was complete. But the fall of Granada was not merely an end, it was a beginning. With the wealth of Al-Andalus flowing into their coffers and their confidence at its peak, Ferdinand and Isabella turned their gaze westward. In their court waited a man named Christopher Columbus, speaking of uncharted oceans and new worlds beyond the horizon. The fall of Granada was more than the death of Muslim Spain. It was the sunset of the medieval world and the dawn of a new global age. From that moment on, Spain would not merely rule a peninsula, it would reach across oceans. The echo of Granada's fall would resound for centuries, in the songs of exile, in the palaces of empire, and in the memory of a world that had once been a crossroads of faith, knowledge, and light.